Nothing warned them. No engines rose from the darkness. No flares cut the sky. The airfield lay exposed, not because it was careless, but because it was confident. And confidence listens for familiar sounds. That sound never came. Fighters were parked wing to wing, dark shapes resting under the assumption of tomorrow. Hangars were sealed. Fuel stood ready. Guards moved through their routines with the patience of men protecting something they believed was already safe. The Luftwaffe had mastered the daylight sky, and in that mastery, the night had been reduced to an administrative inconvenience rather than a battlefield. Above the perimeter, a disturbance moved through the air so lightly it barely existed as sound. It was too slow to announce itself, too weak to demand respect. To doctrine, it was invisible. The aircraft belonged to another age. A biplane, fabric stretched over wood, wings stacked in defiance of modern pride. In the cockpit sat a woman, posture still, eyes fixed on the ground below. She was not searching the sky for enemies. She was measuring distance. Roads, tree lines, and the darker mass of buildings were recalled from memory. This was not improvisation. It was method. She eased the throttle back. The engine's presence faded until only glide remained, air and gravity doing the work. The wire slipped beneath the wings unnoticed. Searchlights stayed idle. Anti-aircraft crews did not react, trained to answer speed with speed and noise with noise. What crossed the field obeyed neither rule. The hangar roof filled the frame. Beneath it lay the war at rest, aircraft packed tightly for maintenance, fuel stored close for efficiency, men and machines arranged for the next day's sorties. In daylight, this geometry meant readiness. At night, it meant vulnerability. The release came without ceremony. A mechanical clunk, weight leaving metal. No scream followed, only falling mass, guided by patience and timing. Fire erupted inside the hangar space, destroying aircraft before they could ever fly again. Pilots woke to flames already inside the perimeter. There had been no duel, no warning, no chance to respond. The mind searched for the missing sound that should have come first, and found nothing. They had laughed at the paper plane because it did not look like war. What they did not yet understand was that war had learned to whisper, and on the Eastern Front, the sky was about to become a place of exhaustion rather than speed. In the East, the war did not behave like a campaign. It behaved like a climate. The distances were not measured in miles so much as in days, roads that dissolved into mud, rail lines that strained under impossible demand, airfields that were never finished before they had to be used. In summer, dust choked engines and lungs. In winter, metal contracted, fuel thickened, and fingers lost feeling before a man even reached the cockpit. This front turned logistics into a second enemy, and the sky, so often imagined as clean and decisive, became another place where endurance mattered more than brilliance. At first, the Luftwaffe appeared built for this world. Its pilots were veterans of earlier victories, trained for aggressive tempo and confident initiative. German air doctrine favored quick concentration of force, sharp strikes, and the belief that the enemy would not recover in time to matter. In 1941, that belief often seemed justified. Soviet aircraft burned on forward strips, caught on the ground in chaotic retreats. Luftwaffe fighters hunted with the calm assurance of men who had turned speed and altitude into habit. In daylight, they could still impose a kind of order on the disorder below. But the Soviet Air Force did what it had to do. It endured. Losses were absorbed, air regiments pulled east, workshops improvised, factories uprooted and reassembled beyond the reach of the first blows. Crews learned under pressure rather than comfort. They trained in broken routines, flew with shortages, and returned to the air not because they were ready, but because the front required them to be. The result was not elegance, it was adaptation, slow, bruised, and real. In that environment, night began to look less like darkness and more like terrain. For the side that could not reliably win daylight engagements, the sun became an enemy's ally. After dusk, speed mattered differently. Visibility collapsed. Pilots lost the certainty of horizon and distance. The sky stopped rewarding the same instincts. And in those hours, a different kind of air war emerged, one that did not seek decisive battles, but steady erosion. German airfields, meanwhile, ran on habit. Schedules were repeated. Threats were categorized. Guards listened for the familiar language of danger, the rising roar of engines, the swelling vibration that meant approaching aircraft at speed. Even flak crews were trained by expectation, when to raise guns, when to wait, what kinds of silhouettes to anticipate. The German advantage was real, but it was also structured, and anything structured can be studied. Soviet planners began to search for seams, places where German superiority became less useful, where confidence could not translate cleanly into control. They did not need to defeat the Luftwaffe in daylight to hurt it. They only needed to disturb its rhythm, disrupt repairs, ignite fuel, force men to wake, make tomorrow's sorties slower, fewer, uncertain. A modern air force can survive losses. It struggles to survive sleeplessness. And in that seam, between what Germany expected and what the night allowed, an old aircraft waited, a machine obsolete by daylight standards, too slow to respect, too small to fear. Yet in the darkness, it was not dead at all. It was waiting for the moment when exhaustion would become the decisive weapon. By the standards of modern war, the aircraft should not have been there at all. It was slow, lightly powered, and skinned in fabric stretched over a wooden frame, more workshop than weapon. In an age defined by metal monoplanes, enclosed cockpits, and rising horsepower, it looked like a mistake that had survived its own obsolescence. On paper, it belonged to training fields and museums, not the front line of the largest air war in history. Luftwaffe pilots laughed when they saw it. They called it a relic, a curiosity, a paper plane better suited for instruction than combat. It lacked speed, altitude, and protection, the very qualities German doctrine had elevated into virtues. To men who trusted engines and acceleration, this machine seemed less like a threat than an embarrassment. It did not fit the grammar of modern aerial combat, and what does not fit is often dismissed before it is understood. Inside the cockpit, the reality was different. The woman flying it was trained, disciplined, and methodical. She did not rely on bravado or improvisation. Her advantage was preparation, navigation memorized, procedures rehearsed, limits understood. Underestimation followed her into every mission, not as an insult, but as an operational condition. It shaped how the enemy reacted, and more importantly, how he failed to react. Her regiment was not tasked with spectacular victories. They were assigned harassment raids, small bomb loads, limited damage, and little recognition. On paper, the missions seemed minor, almost symbolic. In practice, they were designed to accumulate. Each sortie denied sleep, disrupted repair work, and forced airfields into constant alert. Fatigue, not destruction, was the objective. And fatigue, once introduced, is difficult to remove. The aircraft's fragility demanded restraint. It could not be thrown through the sky with force. Every movement had to be measured. But in darkness, that caution became an advantage. Careful flying meant controlled approaches, predictable handling, and an intimacy with the night that faster aircraft could not achieve. Where modern fighters relied on speed to survive, this machine relied on judgment. Its slowness, often mocked, became a form of control. Tight turns were possible where heavier aircraft would stall. Low approaches could be sustained without panic. Time, so scarce in combat, was available here, allowing the pilot to choose when to commit and when to withdraw. In the night sky, speed did not always decide outcomes. Sometimes it only reduced options. The irony settled quietly. What appeared weak was dangerous precisely because it refused to compete on familiar terms. The paper plane, did not challenge German air power head-on. It sidestepped it. And in doing so, it prepared the ground for a different kind of confrontation, one where silence, not strength, would decide who controlled the night. German air power entered the war with a clear philosophy of victory. Speed decided survival. Altitude granted control. Interception, when executed cleanly, ended problems quickly and decisively. These beliefs were not abstractions. They were built from experience, tested over Poland, France, and the early months in the East. In daylight, the Luftwaffe had learned to impose order on chaos, turning the sky into a space where training and horsepower could be trusted to deliver results. The men who thrived in this system became aces. They trusted reflex sharpened by repetition, engines that responded instantly, and visibility that rewarded quick judgment. Combat, as they understood it, was a contest of recognition and reaction. See first. Climb faster. Strike hard. Night, by contrast, felt like an interruption rather than a battlefield. Darkness blurred distances, muted signals, and degraded the instincts that had brought them success. It was tolerated, not respected. On the ground, this mindset shaped airfield life. Defensive routines solidified into habit. Alerts followed predictable patterns. Guards listened for familiar warnings. Engine noise rising, the swelling vibration that meant incoming aircraft at speed. Searchlights and anti-aircraft guns were positioned and timed according to known threats. These systems worked because the enemy usually behaved as expected. Over time, expectation hardened into certainty. Within that certainty, the so-called paper plane found its place, dismissed almost immediately. It appeared in reports and rumors, but never as a serious concern. Too slow to evade fighters, too fragile to survive concentrated fire, too primitive to matter in a war defined by modern machines. If it existed at all, it was assumed to be propaganda, a curiosity exaggerated for morale rather than an instrument of real effect. Confidence, however, is not only belief, it is a filter. Information that fits the model is absorbed and reinforced. Information that challenges it is minimized or ignored. In the Luftwaffe's worldview, danger was loud, fast, and visible. Anything that arrived quietly or moved slowly struggled to register as a threat. The mind rejected what did not match its training. Success made this comfort easy. When yesterday ends in victory, tomorrow is expected to follow the same pattern. Pilots trusted that their dominance in daylight translated into general control. Airfields slept with the assurance that what could not be heard in time could not hurt them. This was not arrogance in the crude sense. It was professional confidence shaped by repeated confirmation. But war rarely breaks belief with spectacle. More often, it erodes it by refusing to behave as expected. The danger in daylight thinking was not that it was wrong, but that it was incomplete. It assumed that combat would announce itself, that threats would arrive within familiar parameters, and that reaction time would always be available. That assumption was about to fail. Not because German pilots forgot how to fight, but because the next attack would not give them the cue they depended on. It would not roar, it would not climb. And by the time it was recognized, the damage would already be done, carried in on a silence they had never learned to fear. Soviet planners did not approach the air war with illusions of symmetry. By 1941, the imbalance was obvious. German pilots held experience, their aircraft held performance, and their doctrine favored decisive engagement in conditions they controlled. Matching those advantages everywhere was impossible. Instead, Soviet command began with a colder assessment. Superiority did not need to be confronted directly if it could be bent at its edges. War, after all, is not won only where strength is greatest, but where certainty is weakest. From that assessment emerged a different understanding of air power. Night harassment was not conceived as spectacle or heroism. It was erosion. The objective was not the dramatic destruction of aircraft in flight, but the steady denial of rest. Airfields were to be kept awake, repairs interrupted, routines broken. A modern air force depends on cycles, maintenance, sleep, preparation, and those cycles, once disrupted, are difficult to restore. Darkness offered a way to interfere without matching speed or altitude. The Women's Aviation Regiment trained accordingly. Night was not treated as an absence of light, but as terrain to be learned and exploited. Routes were memorized until they could be flown without reference to instruments alone. Rivers, roads, forest edges, and the darker masses of settlements became navigational anchors. Timing was rehearsed until it became instinct. Every sortie relied less on improvisation than on disciplined repetition, because discipline reduced risk when visibility could not. Bomb loads were deliberately small. The aircraft could not carry more, and planners did not pretend otherwise. Instead, repetition became the payload. One explosion might be repaired, 10 in a week strained crews, 20 forced delays. Fires that burned briefly still demanded attention, equipment, and manpower. The damage was cumulative, measured not only in craters, but in hours lost and nerves frayed. Many cuts, applied patiently, produced the desired bleed. The simplicity of the aircraft reinforced the method. Fabric and wood could be repaired quickly, often close to the front, with limited tools and materials. Engines were accessible. Systems were uncomplicated. What appeared primitive by modern standards proved resilient under scarcity. While German maintenance required specialized parts and rested crews, these aircraft could be returned to service with speed and ingenuity. Sustainability mattered more than elegance. Each sortie imposed costs beyond the immediate blast. Fuel was burned by search patrols. Ammunition was expended firing at uncertainty. Men were forced into constant alert, waking to alarms that might or might not be real. Attention, always finite, was drained night after night. Confidence, harder to measure but easier to lose, began to thin. The enemy was not being defeated in the air, he was being worn down on the ground. Over time, a quiet doctrine took shape. Victory did not always arrive with decisive battles or visible collapse. It could be assembled slowly, through pressure applied consistently, at points the enemy had not prepared to defend. Exhaustion became a weapon. Sleep became a target. And in the dark hours over the front, Soviet necessity transformed itself into method, one that would soon test whether modern air power could endure a war that refused to let it rest. The advantage did not come from strength. It came from physics. The biplane's slowness, so often treated as a defect, became a form of tactical control once the fighting moved into darkness. Low speed allowed low altitude. Low altitude allowed precision. The aircraft could be positioned patiently, turned tightly, and guided deliberately toward a target without the urgency imposed on faster machines. In the night sky, time became an asset rather than a liability. Near the target, engine power was reduced, sometimes cut entirely. The aircraft transitioned from propulsion to glide, trading noise for gravity. What remained was not invisibility, but ambiguity, sound falling below the threshold of recognition. To defenders trained to associate danger with volume and velocity, this quiet approach created hesitation. The ear heard nothing decisive. The eye saw nothing clear. In that gap between perception and certainty, the aircraft passed through. German fighters were poorly suited to such an intrusion. Designed for speed and altitude, they excelled at intercepting fast-moving targets along predictable vectors. Against a slow aircraft flying low and refusing to climb or accelerate, those advantages became awkward. Overshooting was common. Repositioning took time. The engagement profile did not resemble combat as they understood it. Skill built for one set of conditions struggled when those conditions were deliberately denied. Anti-aircraft defenses fared no better. Guns were calibrated for aircraft that arrived loudly and quickly, allowing crews to judge speed and lead accordingly. Against a slow, gliding target, timing collapsed. Bursts fell ahead or behind. Fire chased shadows. Searchlights swept the sky looking for something that was already beneath their cone. The problem was not incompetence, it was misalignment. The system was answering the wrong question. The aircraft's fragility imposed strict discipline on those who flew it. There was no margin for carelessness. Every maneuver had to be deliberate, every approach calculated. Discipline replaced bravado. Procedures replaced improvisation. That discipline, repeated night after night, became survivability. Pilots lived not because the aircraft could absorb damage, but because it avoided attention long enough to escape it. Mockery on the German side hardened into blindness. The paper plane was not taken seriously, and threats that are not taken seriously rarely receive sustained attention. Vigilance softened, reports were discounted, small losses were explained away as anomalies. Contempt in this context was not emotional, it was operational. It shaped how resources were allocated and how warnings were interpreted. Gradually, understanding shifts. The aircraft itself remains weak, slow, exposed, limited. That truth does not change. What changes is the realization that weakness, when paired with method, can dictate the terms of contact. The biplane did not defeat German air power through confrontation. It bypassed it through patience. And in that lesson lay the deeper danger. If silence could undo systems built on speed and sound, then the Luftwaffe's confidence was resting on assumptions that physics did not respect. The night was no longer empty. It was active, and it was waiting to be used again. Training for night flying was not a romantic initiation. It was controlled terror, repeated until fear became manageable. In daylight, a pilot could trust the horizon, read the weather, and judge distance with the ease of sight. At night, those certainties dissolved. Clouds became walls. Wind became a hand pushing unseen. The aircraft's instruments offered numbers, but not reassurance. Many sorties began with the same quiet thought. If something goes wrong out there, there will be no one to see it happen. The crews learned to navigate with almost no light. They flew low enough that the ground could be read like a map, if the pilot had the discipline to interpret it. Rivers became dark ribbons, roads thin scars, villages small clusters of dimmed lamps or blacked-out outlines. Forests were mass and absence, fields were texture. Each landmark was a promise that the aircraft was still where it was supposed to be. Each missing landmark was a warning that the night had shifted them off course. Weather turned ordinary problems into mortal ones. A drifting fog could erase the earth. A sudden snow squall could swallow the wings. At low altitude, there was little room to recover. A wrong turn, a misread silhouette, a moment of disorientation. These errors did not create dramatic spirals. They created quiet impacts. Wood and fabric met frozen ground, and the war simply removed another crew from its arithmetic. Bombing, in this environment, became intimate. There was no high-altitude release, no long run with time to correct. The aircraft had to approach close enough to see shape, then commit. The release window was brief, measured in seconds, and the consequences were immediate. If the timing was wrong, the bombs fell uselessly into empty fields. If the altitude was wrong, the aircraft flew into its own blast. There was no distance to soften the result. At night, the target was not abstract. It was beneath the wings. Communication on these missions was reduced to essentials. Whispered cues replaced normal speech, not out of superstition, but discipline. Every sound inside the cockpit felt like a violation of the night's fragile concealment. Hand signals passed between pilot and navigator. A tap on the shoulder meant adjust heading. A finger pointed meant a landmark sighted. In such conditions, silence was not only a tactic against the enemy, it was a way of keeping the crew's mind from scattering. The tempo was relentless. Harassment raids were built on repetition, and repetition demanded sorties. Crews flew multiple missions in a single night, returning to the strip only long enough to refuel, rearm, and take brief fragments of sleep, if sleep came at all. Fatigue was not an accident. It was managed like fuel. Minutes were counted, bodies rationed. The regiment's effectiveness depended on an ability to function while tired, to make accurate decisions when the mind wanted to drift. Loss was always present. The aircraft was fragile, and fragility meant mistakes were punished quickly and without romance. A lucky burst of ground fire could shred fabric. A misjudged landing could break a frame beyond repair. Sometimes the enemy did not need to intercept. The night itself was enough. There were no cinematic last words in the darkness, only empty beds and aircraft that did not return. And yet the regiment's character formed not in a single dramatic moment, but in repetition. Courage was not a speech. It was the act of climbing back into the cockpit while tired, while cold, while aware of how thin the margin truly was. Night after night they returned, not because the mission was glorious, but because the method required persistence. And with every takeoff, the quiet question grew sharper. How long could the enemy endure a war that never let him rest? Over time, the raids stopped being improvisations and became a system. The method was simple enough to teach, strict enough to repeat. Approach under power to cover distance quickly. Reduce throttle near the target. Cut the engine on the final run. Glide in on air alone. Release the bombs. Restart, turn away, and vanish back into the dark before the defenses could assemble a coherent response. It was not brilliance in the romantic sense. It was procedure. An engineered routine designed to exploit the one advantage the enemy could not easily counter: delayed recognition. In this system, sound signature became camouflage. Audibility was treated the way daylight pilots treated visibility, something that could be managed, minimized, controlled. The goal was not to become invisible, but to become uncertain. A threat that is loud becomes a target. A threat that is silent becomes a question. And questions force the defender to waste time before he can act. In those wasted seconds, bombs fall, fires begin, and the attacker is already leaving. Targets were selected with the logic of systemic pain. The objective was not always to destroy aircraft directly, but to damage what kept aircraft operational. Fuel stores, repair sheds, maintenance areas, supply dumps, staging nodes where the work of tomorrow was prepared tonight. A small bomb in the wrong place was meaningless. A small bomb in the right place could delay sorties for days. Modern air power depends on continuity: parts, tools, rested crews, predictable schedules. Harassment raids aimed at continuity itself. Behind the front lines, the work of making this method sustainable was quiet and constant. Mechanics patched torn fabric by lamplight, hands moving with practiced economy. Wings were inspected and relaced. Engines were coaxed back into service with whatever parts could be found. Fragility did not vanish. It was simply managed. In the same way that pilots learned to treat night as terrain, ground crews learned to treat weakness as something that could be repaired through routine skill. The German response was predictable in its expense: more patrols, more searchlights, more nervous gunners firing into darkness, more fuel burned on scrambles that found nothing. Airfields shifted from resting to constant readiness, and constant readiness is a slow drain on any system. The defender was forced to spend resources on uncertainty, guarding not only aircraft and hangars, but the possibility of attack at any moment. This is where the deeper strategy revealed itself. Harassment was not minor war. It was war aimed at the enemy's nervous system. It did not need to win a decisive battle to be effective. It only needed to keep the enemy awake, keep him reacting, keep him spending. Every alarm that proved false still extracted a cost. Every night of interrupted maintenance still reshaped tomorrow. The innovation, then, was not a new machine. It was a new use of an old one, turning a fragile, outdated aircraft into a delivery system for silence, repetition, and pressure. And as the method sharpened into routine, the Luftwaffe began to face a problem it could not outfly. A war that attacked the mind before it attacked the hangar. At first, the raids arrived like irritations. Small explosions at the edge of the airfield, brief fires that were stamped out before dawn, a few scorched barrels and shattered windows. The damage rarely looked decisive in morning light. But the raids did not come once. They came again and again. They accumulated the way fatigue accumulates, not as a single catastrophe, but as a steady subtraction from what a unit believed it could endure. For Luftwaffe ground crews, sleep became something taken in portions. Men lay down in their clothes, boots nearby, ears tuned to the siren. They learned to drift off in short, shallow cycles, waking at any change in sound. An alarm could mean an attack, or it could mean nothing at all. That uncertainty was the point. When a system is forced to react repeatedly without resolution, its responses begin to degrade. The body remains awake even when the eyes close, and the mind grows brittle from constant readiness. Fatigue moved quietly through the mechanics' work. Maintenance is a discipline built on small, correct actions repeated without fail. Tightening, checking, calibrating, inspecting. Under strain, those actions begin to slip. A bolt is torqued slightly wrong. A fuel line is seated imperfectly. A tool is left where it should not be. None of these mistakes are dramatic, but in aviation they are costly. Competence does not usually collapse in a single moment. It frays, thread by thread, under the pressure of too many nights without proper rest. Then came the first evidence that could not be dismissed. A German mechanic, climbing onto a hangar roof after yet another alarm, found metal fragments embedded in the structure, shrapnel driven into the heart of the airfield's protected space. It was not a rumor, not a story carried by nerves. It was physical proof that the nuisance had reach. Someone had flown close enough, low enough, and accurately enough to put bombs where they mattered. The paper plane had touched the center. The Luftwaffe responded the way a modern air force responds. It tried to solve the problem with speed. Fighters scrambled into the night, engines screaming as they climbed into darkness, hunting a target that did not behave like a target. But the intrusion was low and slow, slipping beneath patterns designed for fast aircraft. Pilots arrived late, searching wide arcs, overshooting shadows, chasing uncertainty. Their strength, velocity, became waste when the enemy refused to be caught in a predictable engagement. On the ground, gunners began to overreact. Searchlights swept the sky in frantic cones, often finding nothing. Flak bursts tore into darkness, sometimes triggered by sound, sometimes by imagination. Ammunition was expended against silhouettes that vanished as soon as they appeared. The airfield's night became louder, not because the attacker was loud, but because the defender was. And each burst of fire, each false alarm, was another withdrawal from the airfield's limited stock of calm. That was the psychological shift. Laughter giving way to anger, and anger giving way to something more corrosive, unease. The paper plane was becoming a serious problem precisely because it did not fit the categories German doctrine relied upon. It was too small to be satisfying as an opponent, too persistent to ignore, and too quiet to answer with the tools designed for louder wars. By the time the Luftwaffe fully recognized what was happening, the raids had already changed the airfield's internal rhythm. The question was no longer whether the nuisance could cause damage. The question was how long a force built on daylight certainty could function when night itself became the attack. And somewhere in that darkness, the next strike was already gliding in. The assignment marked a shift in intent. This time, the target was not a peripheral strip or a lightly defended staging area, but a high-value airfield where aircraft, fuel, and maintenance facilities converged into a single point of risk. Destroying such a place would not simply cause damage, it would interrupt operations at the source. The mission carried weight because it acknowledged something already learned. The method worked, and it could now be applied where the consequences would be felt immediately. Planning was deliberate and unhurried. Routes were drawn to follow terrain that would break sightlines and swallow sound. Timing was selected to fall between guard rotations, when attention dipped and routine replaced alertness. Even the habits of sentries were studied, not as individuals, but as patterns. The approach did not depend on surprise alone. It depended on predictability, on the enemy continuing to do what he had always done. In the cockpit, preparation gave way to execution. As the aircraft crossed into hostile airspace, the pilot checked her compass once, then again. Bearings confirmed, distance measured, time accounted for. There was no room for second-guessing now. Doubt wasted fuel. Hesitation wasted altitude. The decision, once made, had to be carried through to its end. On the final run, the engine was cut. The transition was immediate and profound. Noise vanished, replaced by the soft pressure of air on fabric and wire. The aircraft slipped forward like something imagined rather than built, nearly inaudible, nearly unreal. Below, the airfield slept within its own assumptions, defenses tuned to listen for a threat that would never announce itself. The hangar complex rose into view. Bombs were released into the clustered heart of maintenance and storage, where aircraft rested in close proximity and fuel waited for morning. The explosions did not scatter across the field. They concentrated. Fire took hold where repair capacity was most fragile, where tomorrow's sorties were assembled tonight. Aircraft burned before they could be moved. Tools and spares vanished in seconds. The German response lagged behind the damage. There was a pause, a moment where the ears reported nothing, and the mind hesitated to believe what the eyes would soon confirm. Alarms followed, but late. Searchlights snapped on after the intruder was already withdrawing. Guns opened fire into an empty sky, reacting to an attack that had already concluded. In that hesitation, the lesson landed with force. Silence was not only concealment, it was delay. It stole the seconds defenders needed to orient themselves, to interpret, to respond. And in war, those seconds decide outcomes. By the time the airfield fully awakened, the method had proven itself at the highest level. The hangar was vulnerable. The rules had been rewritten. And from that night forward, the Luftwaffe would be forced to defend not only against attack, but against the quiet space where the next one would arrive. Luftwaffe aces were not cartoon villains. They were professionals, men shaped by training, experience, and a doctrine that rewarded decisiveness. Their craft was the duel. Fast enemies, visible fights, clear rules of approach and escape. They knew how to read a climbing silhouette, how to convert altitude into speed, how to strike and disengage before the opponent could answer. In daylight, this competence looked like inevitability. At 10,000 feet, they believed they were safe. They were wrong, not because they had forgotten how to fly, but because the war had shifted into a space where their strengths could be made irrelevant. Against a slow intruder flying low and quietly, the duel did not occur. There was no clean interception course, no reassuring closure of distance, no moment where reflex and horsepower could deliver a satisfying conclusion. The intruder refused to climb into their advantage. It refused to race. It arrived like a problem already solved and left before the solution could be applied. For aces trained to win by engagement, the absence of engagement was an insult, and insults tend to provoke mistakes. Scrambles became rituals of wasted effort. A siren rose, engines screamed. Fighters clawed upward, spending fuel and time to reach altitudes where their performance mattered most, only to find nothing there. The target was never where fast aircraft expected it to be. By the time the intercept pattern formed, the raid had already struck, and the attacker had already slipped away under the horizon. Speed, poured into the night, produced only emptiness. Below, anti-aircraft crews grew tense. Searchlights snapped on too late or swept the wrong sector. Gunners fired at movement that might have been shadow or wind or nothing at all. Bursts became less controlled, more frequent, sometimes indiscriminate. Ammunition was spent to quiet nerves as much as to hit targets. The airfield, once orderly even in wartime, began to live in a permanent flinch, every sound a warning, every silence suspicious. For the Soviet crews, the cost was no less real. Night flying demanded a toll paid in cold and fatigue. One pilot returned with her face stung raw by wind, hands stiff, body half frozen from hours in an open cockpit. She climbed down, accepted a brief report, and then, after minutes that barely counted as rest, climbed back in. Not because she felt fearless, but because repetition was the weapon. The method required endurance, and endurance is never glamorous. It is simply continued action when the body argues for stopping. Gradually, the meaning of safe changed on German airfields. Hangars and parked aircraft lost their aura of protection. Darkness stopped being cover and became exposure. Men slept lighter, worked slower, argued more, made decisions with dulled edges. It was not the destruction alone that mattered, but the psychological redefinition of the night. If an airfield could be penetrated silently, then every routine, every assumption of control had to be reconsidered. That was the climax's quiet resolution. The aces could not outfly what they could not reliably detect in time. Their aircraft were faster, their training was sharper, but their advantages depended on early recognition, and recognition was precisely what the method stole from them. In the end, the paper plane did not defeat the Luftwaffe in combat. It defeated a certain idea of combat. And as German defenses intensified in frustration, the night war entered its next phase, because every advantage invites a countermeasure, and every countermeasure forces adaptation in return. The Luftwaffe did not remain passive. Defenses hardened as understanding spread. More searchlights were installed, sweeping wider arcs through the night. Patrols increased, both in the air and on the ground. Airfields that once rested after dusk now stayed awake, wrapped in layers of vigilance. Night became a monitored space, watched and measured, its darkness broken by constant readiness. These measures imposed real costs, but they were unavoidable. Safety now required effort. The regiment adapted in response. Routes were altered to avoid newly lit sectors. Timing shifted to exploit fresh gaps in guard rotations. Targets were reassessed, not for drama, but for effect. If an airfield grew too well defended, attention moved elsewhere, only to return later when routines relaxed again. Approach angles changed, altitudes varied. The method survived by refusing to become predictable. Flexibility, not force, preserved its relevance. Losses continued. The aircraft remained as fragile as ever, vulnerable to weather, ground fire, and simple misjudgment. There was no technological miracle waiting to erase that reality. The method demanded discipline, not mythology. Pilots flew, knowing that survival depended on precision rather than protection. Each sortie carried risk that could not be softened by speed or armor. The price of persistence was constant attention. When crews failed to return, the response was restrained. A brief acknowledgement, quiet grief, no ceremonies that interrupted the schedule. In one instance, a crew gathered at the edge of the strip, spoke little, and then prepared the next aircraft. War does not pause for mourning, and harassment campaigns cannot afford emotional excess. The method relied on continuity, and continuity required restraint even in loss. What emerged over time was a night campaign defined by mutual adjustment. Each side altered behavior in response to the other, like an argument conducted without words. A new patrol prompted a new route. A new light prompted a new approach. Neither side achieved final resolution. Instead, pressure was maintained through adaptation, night after night, sortie after sortie. This was the modern truth taking shape. Warfare is iterative. Every advantage invites a countermeasure. Every countermeasure reshapes the battlefield. Victory is not always found in decisive moments, but in the ability to sustain effective pressure while adjusting faster than the enemy. In that sense, the paper plane did not win the air war. German aircraft still flew. Daylight battles still mattered. But something fundamental had shifted. Safety could no longer be assumed based on speed or strength alone. The night had been claimed as a contested space, and once claimed, it could never again be treated as empty. Night war does not always announce its consequences in wreckage. More often, it writes them into the human body. Repeated sorties carve fatigue into bone, turning judgment into something that must be disciplined and guarded. A pilot who flies at night learns quickly that fear is not the main danger. The main danger is the moment when the mind begins to drift, when reaction slows by half a second, when distance is misread, when a decision feels delayed not by indecision, but by exhaustion. For the crews, life narrowed into cycles so rigid they began to resemble machinery. Briefing, takeoff, darkness, the tense work of navigation and approach, the measured release, the return, then a short interval on the ground, refuel, rearm, a hurried cup of something warm, followed by sleep taken in fragments, never deep, never secure. Night after night, the same pattern repeated until it became less like a mission schedule and more like an imposed rhythm of existence. In that rhythm, even fear changed shape. It stopped being dramatic and became routine. The cockpit's cold was constant. The engine's behavior watched like a living thing, the ground below interpreted as a map of risk. Courage, in such conditions, did not feel like adrenaline. It felt like compliance with procedure when the body wanted only to stop. Decision-making became a form of survival discipline, tight, economical, stripped of anything unnecessary. One of the quieter consequences was the way daylight began to feel unreal. After hours in darkness, the morning sun could look like a foreign element, too bright, too open. Crews stepped from their aircraft into a world that seemed almost peaceful, but peace felt suspicious, like a memory from another life. The mind, trained to expect alarm, struggled to accept calm. Even when no siren sounded, the body listened for it. On the German side, the same corrosion spread in reverse. Constant alarms broke sleep, and broken sleep broke competence. The airfield became a place where men were always half awake, always waiting. Mechanics worked with dulled attention. Pilots climbed into cockpits with minds that had not recovered. Exhaustion became an invisible enemy, more reliable than any bomb. It did not need perfect aim. It only needed time. This is where harassment is often misunderstood. A small bomb is easy to dismiss if one measures war only by tonnage and crater size. But small attacks become large when they reshape function, when they slow maintenance, reduce sortie rates, and make simple tasks take longer than they should. They become large when morale changes, when confidence dissolves into nervousness, and when an organization begins to spend more energy guarding itself than striking outward. The moral weight of night war lies in its quiet cruelty. War harms men without killing them immediately. It dismantles rest. It removes recovery. It turns the mind into a tool that is never allowed to power down. In that condition, the line between endurance and collapse becomes thin, and collapse rarely looks dramatic. It looks like a wrong turn, a missed signal, a moment of impatience. The paper plane, in this sense, became an emblem of pressure. Its bombs were small. Its airframe was fragile. Yet its psychological reach was enormous because it targeted something every army depends on and rarely protects well: sleep. And as the nights continued, the question was no longer whether the raids could destroy equipment. It was whether they could reshape the human beings required to use it. In the long ledger of the Eastern Front, the Women's Night Regiment does not appear as a force that won the air war by itself. The Luftwaffe was not broken by a single aircraft type, and the outcome of the conflict was decided by immense industrial weight, shifting strategy, and the grinding arithmetic of attrition. Yet within that larger story, This regiment holds a clear historical meaning. It demonstrated what disciplined method can achieve when direct competition is impossible. Their results were built not on superior machines, but on tempo, adaptation, and the ability to impose pressure consistently enough that the enemy's routines began to fail. The aircraft they flew remains central to that lesson. By any conventional measure, it was obsolete, slow, lightly armed, and physically fragile. In daylight, it offered little protection and fewer options. But the very qualities that marked it as outdated became, at night, a form of camouflage. Low speed enabled low flight. Simple construction enabled rapid repair. The aircraft's limitations forced careful flying, and careful flying produced survivability. Weak in one domain, it became dangerous in another, not by changing what it was, but by being used where its supposed weaknesses no longer mattered. Post-war memory often turns such stories into symbols, and symbols can become too clean. The reality was harsher. Night missions were cold, sometimes painfully so, with wind cutting through open cockpits and fatigue turning hands stiff. Navigation carried constant risk. One misread landmark, one unexpected patch of cloud, and the aircraft could vanish into the earth without enemy involvement. Routine fear followed the crews not as an occasional emotion, but as a background condition. There were no cinematic dogfights to make the danger obvious, only the quiet knowledge that survival depended on sustained precision under strain. The durable lesson is not simply that old equipment can still matter. It is that technology is not only what a nation builds, but what it learns to do with what it has. Innovation is often imagined as a new machine, a new engine, a new weapon. But here, innovation was a way of thinking, treating sound as something to manage, treating repetition as force, treating the enemy's rest as a target. The aircraft did not become modern. The method did. Their story challenges assumptions without slogans. It does not require exaggeration to be meaningful because its proof is operational. German defenses changed. Airfield routines shifted. Resources were diverted. Confidence was corroded. The paper plane did not win by being stronger. It won by refusing to play the expected game and by making the enemy spend disproportionate effort responding to a threat he did not respect. In that sense, Luftwaffe laughter becomes a historical error, an example of confusing appearance with capability. Mockery lowered vigilance, and lowered vigilance invited methods that exploited it. Institutions rarely collapse from one shocking surprise. More often, they weaken through small threats dismissed repeatedly until the costs of dismissal exceed the cost of adaptation. That is the legacy that remains: method over machine, pressure over spectacle, and a warning written in quiet language. The danger is not always what looks modern. Sometimes it is what looks harmless, until it teaches war to whisper. We return finally to the hangar strike, not as spectacle, but as subtraction. No roaring approach, no visible duel, just a quiet theft of certainty carried out in darkness. The airfield believed itself protected by habit, by doctrine, by the assumption that danger must arrive loudly to matter. What was taken that night was not only aircraft and fuel, but the belief that safety could be heard coming. Judged honestly, the paper plane remains what it always was: slow, fragile, limited. It could not outrun fighters. It could not absorb damage. It could not dominate the sky by force. Yet it was uniquely suited to the logic of night, where audibility mattered more than speed, and patience mattered more than power. It did not overcome its limitations. It arranged the fight so those limitations no longer decided the outcome. Courage, in this story, is not framed as a single dramatic act. It is framed as consistency, flying again after fatigue, returning after loss, trusting procedure when fear and exhaustion argue otherwise. The real test was not the moment of release over the target, but the willingness to repeat the process night after night knowing the margin was thin and the recognition minimal. Sleep, denied to the enemy, was purchased at the cost of one's own. The Luftwaffe aces are reframed as well. They were not fools. They were masters of a specific kind of war, fast, visible, decisive. In that arena, they excelled. But mastery can become confinement. When the fight moved into a domain they did not fully respect, their advantages lost clarity. The failure was not skill, but assumption, the belief that war would continue to follow familiar rules. Here lies the paradox that outlasts the campaign. Modern war celebrates machines, speed, power, innovation measured in metal and numbers. Yet outcomes are often shaped by method and timing, by how pressure is applied rather than how loudly it arrives. The quiet bomb does not announce a revolution. It demonstrates one. The final image is not fire, but motion. A silent glide over darkness, bombs falling like punctuation in a sentence the enemy refused to read. No argument, no flourish, just meaning delivered precisely and too late to interrupt. They laughed at her paper plane until it bombed their hangar silently, and the laughter had nowhere left to hide.